Hello, everyone, and welcome to Session 2B of the Intervening Early Track in the Way Home Virtual Summit, Assessing and Addressing Housing Instability and Invisible Homelessness. My name is Zach Stewart, and I'm going to be running the technical side of things today, and I'm just going to have a couple quick housekeeping slides to run through before we get started. Views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to today's moderator, Carol Bianco-Miller, who is from SAMHSA's Homeless and Housing Resource Network. Carol, can you verify you're with us?
I'm here, and thank you, Zach, and thank you to all of our participants here today. Welcome. Good afternoon and good late morning for those of you in the Pacific time zone or calling in from Hawaii or other Pacific jurisdictions. So we're delighted that you're joining us for this second breakout session in our virtual summit on homelessness, serious mental illness, and substance use disorders. We have, a large number of people who've already who've joined this session, and I'm just delighted. So clearly, this is a topic that is of great interest to each of you, and so we'll try to jump right into the work here and get to our presenters who have some wonderful material to share with you, and we'll hopefully have a very active dialogue at the end. Our to-do list today, our goals for this session is to explain the importance of housing development or of housing stability in serious mental illness and substance use disorder recovery, and to identify strategies for strengthening housing stability. So this is what these are two big goals, and we hope we can move the needle on both of them and give you some new tools and information to walk away from this session today. Our agenda for today includes two speakers, Deb Werner and Gabriela Zapata-Alma, who I'll introduce shortly. We've set aside a good amount of time for questions and answers, and then some closing statements and discussion. But in order for us to set the stage right in the beginning, we'd like to ask you, what are you hoping to get out of this session? This will help us get started with hearing from you. This is our participant-focused approach to learning in these virtual environments, and we want to hear from you. What are you hoping to get out of this session? What is the knowledge and tools and insights and examples and practices? What are you looking for here that will help you to address housing instability and invisible homelessness going forward? We had in the previous session in this track that was focused on intervening early and working with youth and children experiencing homelessness. There were certainly a number of questions that came up that addressed housing instability among youth and families experiencing homelessness, and some questions about trends and lessons learned. And so we hope that this, and in fact we know that in this session you'll get some insights from our presenters, and we hope we'll send you away with some good new information. So thank you, everybody, for greeting us from all over the country. We're delighted to see that we have representation from coast to coast and throughout the middle America, and we'd love to hear that our information and our messages are relevant across this great country. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our first speaker. I won't go into a lot of detail because we have provided you with bios around in the middle of your program, which you each should have received. You'll have bios of all of our presenters and moderators for this session, but specifically on pages 22 and 23, we have the bios for this session's presenters. But just I could briefly introduce Deb Werner by just acknowledging that she is a very valued peer of mine here at HHRN, and she has led our technical assistance efforts for the Technical Assistance Center for the last 3 years and has just done such a wonderful job of that. And I'm just honored to be her colleague. And for many, many years, Deb has been engaged in efforts to leverage individual and community assets to build quality supportive health, housing, and social services that improve recovery and resiliency and social well-being for individuals and families. Deb has really led many efforts to promote gender-sensitive care and appropriate services for women and children. So on that note, I'm turning the microphone over to Deb.
Great, thank you. And Carol, can you just confirm that you can hear me?
I absolutely can, clear as can be.
Beautiful, wonderful. I want to start just by saying how glad I am to be here speaking on this particular topic of the housing instability and addressing invisible homelessness. In the course of my career, I've worked both in homeless services, and a lot of my work has really been around substance use disorders and prevention, recovery supports, and treatment. And so for me, part of what this session offers is that chance to talk a little bit going upstream, so that we're talking about housing instability, kind of focusing more on homelessness prevention. So I've had the opportunity to do a little bit of reflecting of what are the most important things that I really want to speak to you about in this particular topic. And what I'm finding is that what I want to share with you today kind of combines some information from my work with substance use disorders, with families, with homelessness, and then some of my observations around data and trends that we're seeing, and some of which we've actually heard about also this morning in the plenary section, and then also some of my own personal experience as a person in long-term recovery. I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I'm also really excited to be presenting with my colleague Gabriela Zapata-Alma and having Carol Bianco-Miller as our moderator, because I think we're going to have some incredible conversations. So with that, I just want to go to kind of my first point. And that my first point is really that it's very important for substance use service providers, mental health service providers, people who are working with families, to pay attention to housing and home as part of care. And that the way that I tend to like to think, I'm a big advocate for begin with the end in mind. So how I start thinking about mental health and substance use disorder services is really to think about, well, our goal then is mental health. So I want to start with the definition of mental health. And for the definition of mental health from the World Health Organization is a state of well-being in which a person realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So some of those key words that are in there are realizing one's potential, coping with stresses, and working productive and contributing. Those are all part of what we find to be parts of recovery, part of being mentally healthy. And housing really plays a very important role in our ability to do that. So as mental health and substance use disorder people who are working with people to move them towards recovery, this is what our goal is, right? And essential for that success is the home and housing. It gives us kind of that standard place where we can go. So as you're thinking a little bit about this, and as we're getting our pieces going, think about and go ahead and put into the chat box a little bit of what do you look forward to when you're on your way home, or what does home give you? What are some of the feelings, some of the elements that you really get from your home? And if you can put them in the chat box, then everybody will get a sense of opportunity to see that. So we're seeing safety, privacy, comfort, quiet, peace of mind, stability, one of the things that I often talk about is that people need a place as part of their healing to be able to nurse their wounds. So even animals in the wild look for a quiet place to be able to go as part of their healing. Somebody points out a hot shower, family and connection. And so when we don't have those things, then it makes recovery very, very difficult. And we want to be able to think about when we're paying attention to helping people moving into recovery, and it could be a wide variety of recovery issues. Do they have that? And how can they get that if they don't have stable housing? So with that, I want to think a little bit about what we mean by housing instability, because a lot of times we talk about homelessness, and we'll talk a little bit more about homelessness kind of later in the presentation, but there's a lot of different reasons why people end up unstably housed, and this is really just a few of them. Some of them create a huge amount of stress and fear and really threaten our well-being, and some of them are like they prevent us from getting those things that we really particularly need from housing. So one example of those that I really want to take a little bit of a further discussion about is eviction. And that's because eviction in and of itself can be such a traumatic event. It prevents, and there's a couple of different kinds of eviction. So Matthew Drummond, who wrote the book The Evicted and has done a lot of the research, he's out of Harvard, around what the effects of eviction are. One of the things that he talks about is that to pay attention to both formal evictions and informal evictions. And with formal evictions, it really reduces our options of what other housing we're going to be able to get. So if you've gone through a formal eviction process, then a lot of property owners will not consider renting to you. And as a result of that, that often puts you into neighborhoods which are not the neighborhood that you're trying to live in, and clustering into buildings that also cluster other people where the property owners aren't paying very close attention. And that can have very devastating effects for families. African American women are by far more likely to experience eviction than other people, and it really causes huge amounts of stress. We have found that with eviction, there is an increase in maternal depression. There's an increase in there's an increase in detachment from parenting, as well as a number of other different challenges. So one of the things I really want you to pay attention to a little bit is being more aware of what the eviction policies are in your communities, and is somebody sitting there being concerned about eviction. Then there's informal eviction, where the property owner decides you need to leave, you're behind in your rent. They may not be going through the formal eviction process, but they're forcing you to leave. Oftentimes it might be, it might save you from getting that formal eviction, but it's still very stressful, and you're waiting for that other shoe to drop at any moment, and that property owner can have tremendous power kind of over your life. So thinking about how those things are affecting somebody when you're trying to suggest that they do things when they don't know what they're going to do. Other types of places where there's housing instability, being extremely rent burdened. And on my next slide, I'll show you some of the statistics about people who are very low income or just low income and how it rates to the current rent. So being extremely rent burdened, having a rent which is an extreme cost burden is defined as paying 50% or more of your income on rent. Having a rent which is a moderate burden is between 30 and 50%, and kind of the standard is that we ideally would be able to pay only 30% or less of our income on housing. Again, when you have an extreme rent burden and you have a significant percentage of your of your income going to your housing, then you have a tremendous fear of what if I can't make it. if there's an emergency comes up and your car breaks down, the stresses which are created all contribute to difficulty concentrating, difficulty participating and engaging in services, and difficulty, a fear that you're going to be losing your housing. Some of the other elements that are on here, including family separation. So you might be staying with your aunt because your mother is going from house to house to house and your aunt has made room for you. That is very still unstable because you want to be connecting with your family and some of the stresses that are led to in that. Leaving institutions, particularly jails, and then couch serving, overcrowding, all of these contribute to housing instability. And I just looked at a clock piece, so I'm going to move a little bit quicker. So as I indicated, that rents are out of reach for many renters. Just a couple of things to be aware of related to this. People with disabilities, so that first number, that $231, that's somebody who's living on SSI. That's really what is their expected ability to be able to afford housing. And then the bars in red are the costs for the red bar is a one-bedroom apartment at an average of $970 for the fair market rent. The other piece is that for those people who are low income and have a high rent cost burden, about 15% have failed to pay their rent at some point in the last 3 months. So there's a constant fear of getting behind in the rent, running into late fees, and moving, and what that is kind of causing for you. So just thinking about a little bit more, going back to that place around housing, there's really two different things that we get out of our housing. One is physical space, and the other is our sense of home. And both of these play a really, really important role. So your housing determines where you live, where your children go to school, what access to employment you have, what access to services that you might be able to offer or participate in. There's an epidemiologist, Earl Chambers, who's done a lot of work around housing and social determinants of health. And one of the things he looked at in the Bronx was sleep problems. And part of what he found was that there is, he was comparing vouchers and public housing, and that sleep problems, if you don't feel like your housing and your neighborhood are safe, that contributes more to sleep problems than just the affordability factor. So we really do want to recognize the importance of having people be able to live in places where they're feeling stable and how that contributes to their well-being. The other point that's on this slide is that people don't always want to relocate to new communities. Los Angeles County has recently called for all of the city council districts to identify and build housing because there's this assumption that people are all moving from different places into the homeless kind of community, when in reality most people experience housing stability and move fairly close. So, change is hard for everybody, and part of what we really want to do is build some opportunities for people to kind of stay safe in their own local communities. And I'm just glancing to see that I've gone way over in terms of my time. So I want to just make a couple of more points. The second point is, as mental health and substance use disorder providers, we really do want to be proactive and hold preventative discussions on housing, the impacts on family, and on choices in terms of what housing we have. Dennis Colhane gave some statistics around suicide and homelessness, first time to experience homelessness and that close relationship. We need to be having those conversations, and we really want to have those conversations before people move into an experience a homeless setting. The third point that I want to make is this question of, are we homeless? Am I homeless? And the importance of language. So there are a lot of people who, the term homelessness has a fair amount of stigma to it. And a lot of people may be experiencing housing instability, but they don't particularly identify as being homeless. So if you ask the question, are you homeless? Some people may say no to that question for a wide variety of reasons. So I thought about a friend of mine, Lewis, who goes way out of his way to protect the fact that he doesn't have a place to live, because for him, that term homelessness conjures up failure. And he does not consider himself a failure, though he has not been able to consistently house himself for the last several years. So we want to be careful to think about, in terms of what services we offer, what are we asking people? I also thought of a young woman, Jillian, who would say she was never homeless, despite the fact that she was living at a friend of a friend's house as she completed high school, and she would never say she was homeless because that might get her father into trouble. And then the last example that I use is actually myself. So as I mentioned, I think at the beginning, I'm a person in long-term recovery, and I spent a time as I was very young camping. And I actually had been in recovery for several years when I realized that when I was able to draw a map to the place I was camping to get food stamps to be delivered at general delivery, that I actually could have met definitions of homelessness, and it never had even occurred to me. So we want to be careful kind of what language we use. We want to think about saying things like, where are you staying? Where are you going to go after we leave here? Do you have a place, if somebody's taking medications, do you have a place where you can keep your medication safe? Because, oftentimes when we don't have housing stability, we also don't have a place for our things. Our prized possessions, never mind some of those other kinds of pieces. So I think that those are some of the pieces that I really wanted to bring in. I put in here what HUD's definitions of homelessness are, and we tend to think a lot and talk a lot, and it is really important to be addressing those people who are unhoused and experiencing unsheltered homelessness or living in shelters, but we also don't want to forget about addressing some of the other kinds of homelessness that people experience. And in a document that's specifically targeted towards youth, HUD goes on to define some of the other definitions of what constitutes homelessness. So someone who is trading sex for housing. So I might be staying at my friend's house, but really I don't particularly like that friend. But as far as I'm concerned, I have a place to live. So that often kind of constitutes can constitute homelessness in the HUD definition. And the importance of the HUD definition is it qualifies you for a lot of different specific kinds of programs. So we do want to keep that part in mind, but we also want to keep in mind like what people are thinking about in terms of what their choices are. I'm not going to spend very much time on this, but one of the sort of last points that I want to make is that we really want to provide housing-related support as early as we possibly can. We want to encourage people to be thinking about what kind of things do they want to have in terms of where they're living, what their home looks like, and where they can keep their journal. And there are a variety of different kinds of programs. They often speak a slightly different language than our programs. So housing counseling programs, tenant education and tenant rights programs. Assistance in accessing safe and affordable housing is, of course, an important part of that, as is rapid rehousing and eviction prevention resources, which I think we've increased in our opportunities in terms of some of the resources that we now have available. Gabriella is going to talk a lot more in terms of some of the resources that are available to people who are experiencing intimate partner violence, but that's another place where it can be very difficult for somebody to feel like they can't leave because they're leaving their entire home and that uncertainty that comes up. So I'm excited to hear what she has to say about that. And then the other piece in terms of home-based case management, some of the peer supports to help people, especially those people who've never been stably housed, who may have grown up in foster care or lived in institutions for a long time. There are some things we don't always know how to do, how to manage a household, how to respond to a leaking faucet, because the faucet is leaking, so I'm really afraid I'm going to get kicked out or blamed. And so I don't call the property owner, and then that faucet ends up causing ceiling damage in the unit next door. So building in some of those kind of tenant education, the home-based supports for people can also be really, and not everybody needs these. You know, some people just need some help to move into an alternative type of housing that better fits their need, and then they do fine with the supports that they're already receiving from you. Other people need additional supports, kind of ongoing, and then support to help people access. Sometimes it's immediate housing and emergency shelter. One quick word around women is oftentimes we're really afraid DCFS is going to remove our children, so we're going to work really hard to protect it if we don't have a place to stay. And intervening as quickly as you can, you know, that is not grounds in and of itself for removal of children. So helping people to access immediate housing, or as well as then the longer-term subsidy programs, housing counseling, and then addressing the safety, income and employment services, of course, are keys. And then I'm just going to kind of close with this last slide around building community. One of the things that Dennis Culhane talked a little bit about was the difference between some of what we're seeing now with the millennial generation and the older generation in our housing. And related to that, you know, I guess the film Advocates talked about the younger generation doesn't have the same goals necessarily related to housing as older generations. It's not necessarily a two-car garage with 2.2 children and a picket fence. They may be looking for getting security in slightly different ways and looking to build community and resources with each other. The recovery housing community, where people are building that sense of community and mutual support, is another example that may be short-term, but sometimes it's a really long-term strategy for people. So with that, I'm actually going to close and turn it back over to Carol and then to Gabriella to continue the conversation. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Deb. And here are some resources that Deb, I think, referenced during her talk, and also will be available to you when you receive the handouts, the presentation following the summit. So that was really a very thought-provoking presentation, Deb, and we really appreciate your sharing a different point of view around housing instability and invisible homelessness and how to begin to address that. It's been a lot of discussion in the chat box and some questions that have been posed, so we'll get to those at the end of Gabriella's presentation, but I suspect we'll have a lively discussion. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Gabriella Zapata-Alma, who is the Director of Policy and Practice for Domestic Violence and Substance Abuse at the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Gabriella brings 15 years of experience working with people living with HIV and AIDS who are impacted by housing instability, substance use disorders, and mental health conditions, as well as survivors of domestic violence and other trauma. And for more details about Gabriella's background and where she's currently practicing and working, I will just direct you to page 23 of your program. But most important, pay attention to what she has to share with us, because she's a wealth of information and experience and insight. So welcome, Gabriella.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you so much, Deb, for setting us up and really situating housing and home as part of our overall well-being and the importance of home in connection to community, and really paying attention to that within our health-focused services. I also really loved hearing the different ways that we can talk about safe and stable housing without using yes or no questions or just using labels. So thanks so much for that. And thank you so much, Carol, for the introduction and for shepherding our conversation. So I'm here joining us with many thanks to SAMHSA and the HHRN from the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. And we're a FIPSA-funded special issue resource center dedicated to addressing the intersection of domestic violence, trauma, substance use, and mental health. And this is just, of course, my brief disclaimer. So I wanted to start out hearing from all of you. So given the critical role that safe and stable housing plays in overall health and well-being, why might we hesitate to really have these conversations around current housing status and potential housing needs? You can go ahead and type in the chat box. I'll give you all some time. Absolutely. Stigma, shame, not wanting to hurt our clients, not wanting to offend our clients, lack of experience, not being sure how to have the conversation. Clients who are afraid of losing children, absolutely. CPS involvement is a huge fear factor. Not wanting to hurt the relationship with clients. Natalia, this is so important what you said. Not having an immediate solution should there be housing needs. I can so relate to that myself, even having been a housing provider for over a decade, and have seen it in so many of my staff as well. Just feeling like there aren't enough options and resources, and really feeling that hesitation. How do I open this up when I might not have something to really immediately help? And even thinking about some considerations of kind of ethically opening something up when we're not quite sure how to help someone in that situation. Thanks, everyone. So some other things that are common barriers, some other things that get in the way, an assumption that someone must be safe or stably housed if they haven't asked for housing resources, considering housing as being outside of the scope of our services or outside of our expertise. That sense of overwhelm is so real. I've felt it myself many, many times. Feeling really unfamiliar with housing resources. I can just think time and time again when we'd ask staff for what kind of training would you like to receive, it was like housing resources, the housing system. It's such a difficult system to kind of wrap our head around. And I remember when I first started working in housing services, having come from community-based and more homeless outreach services, I thought to myself, oh, I'm not going to have to worry about getting people housing anymore because I'll be the housing provider. And little did I know that housing would then be the main thing I'd be focused on. But I'm very thankful for that time in my life, and housing stability is certainly at the heart of my services. And then the available housing resources don't match the needs of the people in our programs. This can be a really big barrier when we feel like, or when not even when we feel like, when it's the reality many times, that the services that are available that we may be aware of are really focused on literal homelessness, and we may be working with someone who doesn't meet that definition, or as far as we know doesn't meet that definition, and then we are feeling really stuck about what can we offer these folks before they reach the point of literal homelessness. And then we also see that there are a lot of barriers to conversations for survivors of intimate partner violence. We know that intimate partner violence has significant negative impacts on an individual's access to safe and stable housing. And we also know that survivors may be at an increased danger and at increased risk when they disclose their experiences of abuse. And those risks can come from the person who is perpetrating the abuse and using violence against their intimate partner, violence and control. It can also come from our service system, Having talks with different providers who weren't quite sure what to do when a disclosure was made. And I can think of one situation where a provider had called police without the survivor asking for that or knowing, and how that really increased the survivor's danger from having disclosed the IPV. So something to keep in mind here is that fleeing domestic violence and attempting to flee domestic violence is part of the definition of literal homelessness. And yet, if we are waiting for somebody to be able to disclose the fact that they're experiencing domestic violence, which again can become another label that people many times don't even identify themselves with, then there can be a whole host of people who qualify for housing resources who will never know it, right? Just because of all the barriers to conversations around safe conversation around IPV. And so one thing that we can do in being responsive is really making information available about housing that doesn't require people to disclose their domestic violence or their intimate partner violence. And I wanted to offer some data just to help link intimate partner violence, trauma, experiences of homelessness and housing instability, mental health, and substance use disorders. So we know that IPV and lifetime trauma can have significant mental health and substance use disorder-related effects. So much so that we have seen how it can increase chronic pain, it can increase risk for overdose, and there are many risk factors when it comes to suicide attempts, and of course depression and PTSD. And we also see high rates of IPV among women experiencing homelessness. And so 80% of women with children experiencing homelessness have also experienced intimate partner violence. And 57% of women experiencing homelessness report intimate partner violence as the immediate cause of their homelessness. And yet so often this is something that our service systems have become really siloed, and that many times that collaboration and that cross-training is really important to be able to effectively serve this population. So some things that we can do in increasing our responsiveness. First off, recognizing the prevalence of domestic violence, including mental health and substance use coercion, which is when someone who uses power and control and violence against their intimate partner really uses the partner's mental health or substance use status, really targets their mental health or substance use as part of their tactics of control. So a lot of times we see how when people who are experiencing intimate partner violence attempt to access services around to support their mental health or address their substance use disorders, that abusive partners can actually attempt to interfere and try to keep them from being able to access those resources. Attending to confidentiality as a safety need, integrating conversations that IPV is unfortunately a common experience, and really addressing that shame and that stigma, and inspiring hope that there are resources available that can help, and then providing information about intimate partner violence and resources that may be available to someone without requiring them to disclose or talk about IPV. And so I want to point folks towards the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. We have a toolkit that is all about integrating responsiveness to domestic violence within our behavioral health and primary care settings. And so feel free, I have that, it's on our website, and I believe I have the link available later. So now moving into supporting housing stability. So I want to hear from y'all again. What are your current strategies for supporting safe housing stability? Teaching life skills. Following up with aftercare services, absolutely. Connecting folks with case management. Supporting budgeting. Peer support. Thinking outside the box. assistance with funding for rent and deposits. Absolutely. Thanks so much, everyone. So I wanted to be sure to include some information on the formal network of systems to support housing stability. And so there are different kinds of subsidized housing programs. There are a whole different kinds of types and sources. Here I just put some of the ones that are more common. So permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, HOPWA, housing choice voucher, and so much more. So many more types. I don't want to imply that there's enough resources. There's never enough resources for stable housing. And then we also see that there are formal resources for housing tailored for specific experiences or needs. So there are programs that are designed to support veterans. There are DV programs, recovery housing, senior housing, safe havens, different kinds of reentry programs, as well as housing programs really focus on supporting families that are involved with child welfare. And then here's some other network of systems. And so we know that SAMHSA has the Projects for Assistance in Transition from Homelessness, the PATH-funded programs. HUD has many coordinated entry systems for their continuum of care. There's LIHEAP, as well as more local and municipal emergency financial assistance programs. Some really innovative practices I've seen is having housing navigators rotate across different secondary sites. And so I had the opportunity to oversee a housing advocacy program that worked with supporting folks in entering and accessing housing subsidies, as well as supporting folks in being able to locate and access just fair market affordable housing. And so we had our network of housing advocates rotating from food pantries, different public health clinics, to different drop-in centers throughout the week. And so that would be that really helped increase access to this program. So now I wanted to take some time to talk about some kind of informal, some non-formal ways to help folks access and increase their housing stability. And so one thing I want to say is just exploring all possible paths to safe and stable housing. So this is what I think a lot of us tend to think of the both and approach. And so I want to tell you a story. When I was overseeing formal behavioral health treatment focused on folks with substance use disorders and serious mental health conditions, we were serving somebody who, at the time that she entered our program, she was living under a bridge. And we were working really hard to get her connected with different resources, get her on some housing wait lists. But it wasn't until we were having a team meeting and really reviewing her care and getting a sense of what we could be doing better to help her better meet her needs that it came to my attention as the director that she was currently on parole. And so I asked the question, okay, well, what was the address that was used when she paroled out? There needed to be some kind of, address that was offered. And staff found out that she'd used her sister's address. And so we started working with her and working with her sister to see what we could do to really offer her sister support and support their relationship, support their sisterhood, to see whether there would be some times that the person that was in our program would be able to stay with her sister. And so through this support, we actually found that she went from being able to stay with her sister sometimes to then her sister really seeing us as a source of support and being able to reach out to us when things were feeling really difficult at home. And this intervention was so successful that when her sister moved to be closer to her job, she actually got a bigger apartment so that our client would have her own room and would be a permanent resident in the home. And then when the client's name came up on a wait list for permanent supportive housing, the client actually turned it down and said that she was feeling really good living with her sister and that their relationship was going really well and that family support was proving to be really, really instrumental in her recovery. And so I just wanted to share that story to really highlight the need for creativity and really pursuing every possible path towards safe and stable housing. And that this needs to also include cultural resources. And so I wanted to tell another story here of a mom I was working with in a vocational program providing resource advocacy and financial skill building support, and how she had been able to obtain a full-time job and was paying affordable fair market rent on her own. But then during that time, I was helping her with a lot of financial planning and budgeting, and at that time, she had included tithing in her budget. And a supervisor I had at that time in a supervisory meeting had said, kind of pushed back on that a little bit, kind of said, well, is this really the best time for her to be tithing? How else would she be using that money? And I said, this is her money and this is her choice. And if it's important for her to tithe, then I'm just here to support her in that, right? And then what ended up kind of unfolding was that her employer actually ended up going bankrupt and was having trouble making payroll and was several paychecks behind. And so she started having trouble affording rent. And she was able to go to her faith community and get some financial assistance from her faith community, and was able to kind of plug that gap during the time that she was job searching in order to find a job that would actually pay her, right? And then I wanted to highlight what many have kind of brought up already, both in the public chat as well as Deb has brought up, and really the power of peer-based services, the power of shared experience. And so especially when there is so many multiple folds of shame and stigma involved in the experience of potentially of housing instability, the experience of mental health or substance use related concerns, the experience of intimate partner violence, what it means to be, even a parent experiencing any of these things, just all the ways that shame and stigma overlap in a person's experience. And so one program I worked with was we developed a peer-based approach to housing advocacy for people experiencing housing instability who are also impacted by HIV. And how powerful it was to see how people were not only much more able to access safe and stable housing, but then all of the skills that they gained along the way and all of the self-determination and self-efficacy. I remember doing a focus group with some of the people who had been through that program just in its pilot year, and just time and time again, people saying, the housing navigator was always telling me how I was the one housing myself. He was showing me every step of the way what I needed to do, but he was always telling me that I'm the one who's showing up, I'm the one who's doing this. And how then that self-determination and that self-efficacy then comes to really becomes woven into the fabric of all of their other life goals and their overall wellness. And then also the employment of recovery coaches. That recovery coaches are many times people who have lived experience of long-term recovery, and so often when people are so done talking to a counselor, they still very much so are happy and willing to get a cup of coffee with a recovery coach, someone who has been there, has walked in their shoes, and can kind of tell the tale. And so just really the importance of centering the voices and the lived experience of people in our services. And so in summary, just wanted to highlight some takeaways. That the lack of safe and stable housing is highly stressful and really exacerbates and contributes to any kind of health condition. That safe and stable housing is the foundation of health and well-being, and so as people who are supporting others in their health, it's absolutely within our core services. Many folks may not realize that they qualify for resources, and we ourselves may not be aware of what resources are available, and that we can support housing stability through creating environments of support within our programs, engaging in non-labeling conversations, increasing our awareness of housing resources as well as cultivating those housing resources, and then always using our teamwork and creativity. And with that, here's my contact info. Feel free to reach out to me. And of course, with appreciation for SAMHSA, some references, and I'll hand it back to you, Carol.
Oh, thank you so much, Gabriella. And we have quite an active public chat going with lots of interaction amongst our participants and some ideas being shared, as well as a number of questions, and I think we may only get to one or two of them. So I am going to pose one that I would really like to that I think is going to take some time, but I want to put it out there because I know that it's something that comes up often. Certainly when I've done training on housing in the past, it's one of the major concerns. And it's one participant said that for over 20 years I've heard from providers that they will only house individuals who have a certain amount of clean time. Their reasoning is that an individual who is using is too triggering for others who live there and are in recovery. Can you address how providers can support individuals who are in different stages of recovery, living in the same building? So, Deb, maybe you could start, and then Gabriella jump in, and then we'll see if we have time for one more.
Oh,
it's a big one, I know.
Pick a challenging one. So, you know, I worked for a number of years with an organization that had a lot of buildings. Some were sober living buildings, and some were specifically for other special populations, and some were updated single-room occupancy hotels that for people who had been formerly homeless mostly, but also just, you know, provided that kind of stable housing, and they had created a whole community. And in their sober living buildings, they did not accept people who were relapsing in their substance use. And I'm using quotations next to the word relapse because I know we try to talk more about setbacks for that very reason. Now, they were able to do that because they were able to automatically move that person into another kind of housing unit and provide the supports there. There have been, you know, I personally think that the key, most important thing is choice. And you do want to be respectful of those people who want to be able to live in an alcohol and drug-free environment, and that it can be disruptive to have people who are continuing to be there who are not participating in that kind of community. You want to be able to offer that kind of recovery supportive environment. That said, most recovery housing I know does provide opportunity for people to pick themselves back up. That it isn't like somebody uses and then they immediately have to leave forever. But you know, especially if you're providing the housing, you want to be able to make sure that people aren't bringing illicit substances on site. There's some different pieces like that. And I'm seeing somebody in the chat is talking about MAT friendly. I'm not speaking about MAT when I'm talking about substances there, because I think, yeah, both NAR and the Oxford houses have recognized the importance and value of MAT. I'm speaking about, you know, that's just a different, to me, that's a different form of abstinence. And somebody can be in recovery and still using different medications that they need to use. So that said, I think that there's also the importance of having a housing first orientation. You know, one of the things that we have learned over and over and over again is that we don't want to think of, Tanya Tully used to say this often, housing should not be a reward for good behavior. So just like we're talking about the importance of healthcare across our nation today, you know, we have and there's increased recognition that housing is healthcare, that it's important to appreciate that we want to help people get into housing and get into home as quickly as they can. And that helps contribute to making alternative choices. So I'd say that would get us started, is that importance of having choice so that different people can choose different things. I also support, you know, different kinds of alternative housing models, as well as if somebody really wants to be living in a nuclear family focused individual housing unit, that also should be a choice for everyone, not just a specific few. So I think that you know, having those different models is really important. And one last other point on that, although it ties, it kind of goes back to part of what Gabriella was talking about in terms of paying attention to problem-solving conversations and what do people need. There are a lot of people who are trying to enter recovery whose families feel like they don't want them to come support, that they don't want to, whose families don't want them to come back home because they don't trust them in terms of that they, you know, they've had bad experiences, etc. And there are also youth who don't want to go back towards their families or don't feel like they could ask somebody to stay with them. So housing and family counseling are really important ways to build some of those opportunities for additional stability and figuring out how to make it work, kind of going back to the story that Gabriella was talking about with the sister. And just to respond to the chat, yes, I did say that Oxford House does have a position that should accept MAT. That is coming from Oxford House National, and you should be able to find that just by Googling them. So
Thank
with
you,
that,
Deb. Yeah, thank you. That was a great response.
Not a topic I'm not passionate about.
Yes, I know. Well, I had quite a few options, and I selected one that I thought would resonate for both of you as well as for our listeners, and clearly it has. I think the, you know, sort of the bumper sticker for what you're saying is options. You know, options are essential. And so if you only have, you know, a one-size-fits-all approach and response is just not enough, is not appropriate. So, Gabriella, do you have anything you would add to Deb's response to this question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Carol. So I'm thinking from the perspective of the kind of the case manager on site, the program manager on site, and the director who sometimes gets called into these conversations. Some things that have been really helpful in navigating this, because it is a common concern, and it does come up, I think, in all of our programs at one point or another if we do have any kind of communal or congregate living situation, as well as an outpatient setting. So one thing I would say is really facilitating community conversations. So having those ongoing community, whether it's a house meeting or, you know, having some, we would have community recovery community meetings in our outpatient behavioral health, and that helping to facilitate those connections and help people to work through their own concerns. We're then helping them, we're helping them to build skills that are going to serve them for all the other concerns that they're tackling in their life. And that it's not necessary, sometimes we as providers can get somewhat overprotective and think that we need to kind of come in and kind of solve everything for everyone, right? Like we like to fix problems, when sometimes what we need to do is really help people to build the skills to have these conversations on their own. And so I can think of one of the settings I was in where there was a person who was in recovery, had been sober for a couple years, and had been experiencing homelessness when she was using. And it was very disturbing to her to see people that she assessed to be under the influence. And through having facilitated discussions as well as providing a lot of staff support, she was able to come to a place where she was able to say, you know what, I was out there on the street when I was using, and I don't want that for anyone, and everyone deserves somewhere safe to live, kind of no matter whether or not they're using. And I would say that the key to that is supporting the person with, building skills around dealing with cravings that come up or other kinds of responses that come up for them, and then helping to really build some of those interpersonal skills, those conversational skills, those problem-solving skills, and then support not only within the program from staff, but also helping people plug into communities of support. So I think of another person who, he was in recovery from crystal meth use, and someone moved in across the hall from him who was actually using crystal meth and who he had actually used crystal meth with at one point. And when he and I were talking about it, I was meeting with him in his unit. When he and I were talking about it, I said he was someone who was using 12 steps. And so I asked him, well, what do you think your sponsor might say, or is your sponsor a source of support as you think about this? And he ended up talking with his sponsor, and obviously sponsors are all human, right? Like, we're all human. But his sponsor was in recovery from alcohol, and her response was, I have to walk by a liquor store every day on the way to work, right? There's always going to be some temptation around the corner, and what we're going to do is work on figuring out what kind of support and resources you need to be able to face that challenge rather than hiding from that challenge. And so really looking at what supports are in place for the person they have access to, how do they want to access support, and not just within our program, but also within the community.
Well, thank you. We also received a thank you from our participant who posed that question, and thanks you both for such a comprehensive answer. This is clearly something that is one of the challenges in addressing invisible homelessness and housing instability. We have a bunch of questions here, so I need to sort of pick a couple. We have about 5 more minutes or so before we have to move to closing comments. But one question was, can you recommend, or do you use, or are you aware of tools or questionnaires or some consistent approaches to identifying or assessing invisible homelessness among people that are served in various settings? We talked about the importance of asking questions and, just being aware of it as an area that should be part of your conversations. Certainly that's something that clinicians, case managers, peer support workers can incorporate into their practice, but sometimes it's helpful to have tools or protocols for things like that. Are there anything you would recommend? And this would be for either of you.
This is Deb. There is a pretty comprehensive family housing stability assessment tool that I don't have at my fingertips. So I'm going to guess if you Google family housing stability assessment that it quite likely would pop up, but I'm not sure, and I can try to do a check on that. But also remember, there's so many different ways and avenues towards housing instability. So, I encourage everybody to also be doing screening for intimate partner violence. You can ask people questions about, do you worry about being able to pay your rent, or are you at risk of eviction? You can ask them questions like that. You can start to identify some of the, do you know where you're sleeping tonight? If somebody if you encourage people to do something that with writing and they don't have a place to put the things, that's a pretty good indicator of a lack of stability. So just building, I think most of it is building that conversation and that rapport. Do you know where you're sleeping tonight? You know, kinds of pieces. Because sometimes it's, you know, it's providing that opportunity for that support. And oftentimes there's just a couple of specific questions that will help. And then there are, you know, domestic violence assessment and screening tools as well.
And I guess if any of our participants have any tools or that they use or are aware of, I certainly would encourage folks to, you know, put that in the public or share that in a public chat. I think one place to start might be to go back through your presentation, Deb, and to look at those, some of the definitions or risk factors for housing instability and see how those could be converted into a questionnaire or incorporated into a clinical assessment. So, and I think we may be close to our end. I guess we've got a few minutes that I will invite Gabriella and Deborah and Deb to do make some final comments, or if you have anything else that you'd like to, that you've noticed on the chat that you'd like to sort of pick up on. We have 2 minutes set aside for open mic here, and if you have some final comments, and then we'll move to closing. So, Gabriella?
Yeah, I would say just I think something that's always helpful is being really present with folks, being really attentive, really present, having that gentle curiosity that isn't nosy or trying to interrogate folks, but just being able to be really present with folks, but also kind of step back and look at what might be the bigger picture for them. I remember there was one gentleman who was coming to our outpatient treatment, and every time he'd come in, he'd say, "Hey, you got that housing for me yet?" And I remember the counselor, you know, very kind of in his own wondrous humanity was like, like this person doesn't qualify for any housing resources. They're housed, like, I don't know why they keep asking me this, right? And being able to have the importance of having that really intact supervisory support so that staff can say, like, why is this coming up in this way? And that for those of us who maybe aren't directly in the situation and aren't feeling that same level of very kind of normal frustration, to be able to step back and go, well, I wonder what is going on at home for this person, and I wonder how this is this person's way of connecting. Is there like stigma around mental health and substance use, or is there a high level of conflict at home, you know? So that gentle curiosity and that ability to hold kind of multiple truths, realizing that life is complex, and being able to suspend judgment, all of that is going to help us really intervene early when someone may be in a situation that is not stable and or not safe.
Thank you. And Deb, do you have any closing comments?
Well, I really liked how Gabriella put that in terms of the making that personal touch. And, you know, and I guess I'm still thinking a little bit about that, the difference between engaging in that conversation and formal assessment, which is also important. But I think a lot of times what happens is right now people don't ask people about their housing because they're afraid that they won't know what to say if they hear about the problem. So it's kind of what would I do with that information? I wouldn't know how to handle it, so that I don't want to ask. And that's a disservice to people. And then going into that formal, I'm going to spend the next very long period of time doing an assessment without having resources. That's probably even more of a disservice to people. So what I want to encourage you all is to have that openness that Gabriella is talking about, that curiosity and that caring, And then also, we are so siloed still in our communities. So it can be very difficult to know what the resources are. So take the time to identify a person or a potential resource. You know, it might be like help for utilities, and make that information available to people so that you're able to provide those resources for people, or you're able to help people get in touch with others, because we all know that success begets success. And thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, both of you, and thank you to all of the participants who've been sharing fabulous resources with each other and a lot of feedback and ideas throughout this session. So it's been a very stimulating and certainly very relevant discussion. Clearly, we have people who are wrestling with this issue out in communities, wanting to help people become stably housed or prevent instability and homelessness, but lacking the resources in communities to really be able to respond in a timely manner. So your point, Deb, about being afraid to ask the question because you have no tools to respond to is certainly something that we've been hearing from folks in the chat and resonates to me. So I appreciate the dialogue, I appreciate the information, and I appreciate all of our participants for this great work that you all are doing and your passion and concern for the individuals. Please take a minute and let us know what you will take away from this session. We really, really value this feedback along with the evaluation feedback, which we'll be asking you to provide. This helps us to focus our efforts going forward, and we want to be able to make sure that we're providing actionable information and tools and resources for you. So take a moment and tell us, what did you take from this, and how will you use that information? So appreciate you taking a moment to do that. I'll remind you that this session and this two-day virtual summit, The Way Home, is being sponsored by SANS's Homeless and Housing Resource Network. HHRN provides technical assistance virtually and in person. And so we encourage you, if you have any interest in receiving further technical assistance, please let us know by emailing us at this address. And we certainly want to thank you on behalf of SAMHSA for your commitment to people with serious mental illness, substance use disorders, communities and families that are wrestling with these challenges and creating opportunities. So thank you so much. On that note, without further ado, I will end our session for this afternoon. I'll encourage you to take a short break and then join us at our roundtable session, and that will help us to tie up, this day, this wonderful, exciting, stimulating, and validating day. Please join us at that session.